so-called Negro community has shocked the white man by resisting all efforts to divide us. I think that you and I should continue to shock him by staying and working together in unity, despite religious, political, economic, or educational or social differences.
My people are terrified. We've been terrorized to the point that we're mentally and spiritually paralyzed. We suffered through centuries of dehumanization and degradation. It took the form of slavery and segregation in this land of the free, where oppression's government sanctioned. We're subjected to systemic skin color discrimination, from black codes to Jim Crow to black criminalization. It's been 400 years, it's time for our liberation. We're a nation within a nation, victims of colonization. Where's our revolution and Independence Day celebration? Cause what's the 4th of July to the slave on the plantation? And slavery didn't end, they just changed its implementation. Just check the 13th Amendment, then you'll see why so many black males end up as guilty defendants. The system isn't broken, it's working as it's intended. So I'm not here to fix it, I'm here to end it.
And then again, if we tell you that Negroes are being hung on the tree or being shot down illegally, unjustly, and those Negroes should do something to protect themselves, you say you're advocating violence.
I won't rest till this nightmare we're living in ends, and we see justice for our murdered young innocent men. If black lives really matter, black people need the proof. Cause we are the only ones responsible for our improvement. How can we leave it to someone else to do what's best for us, especially when there's someone else has historically been oppressing us? We can't use a system built to enslave us to free us, and we really sick if we think that they white Jesus can heal us. Our children need us to defend them, teach them and guide them, show them love and bring out the greatness that is deep inside them. Are we gonna build a nation or stay on the plantation? Keep begging for our freedom or fight for our liberation?
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he didn't say get nonviolent. He said praise the Lord, but pass the ammunition.
We must be willing to die together or we'll definitely die separately. We desperately need unity if liberation is our destiny. If we don't know our history, then we doomed to repeat it. White supremacy is the enemy, but together we can defeat it. They stole us from the motherland, sold us into slavery, forced us to work for them. They got the nerve to call us lazy. In this caste system, we're outcasts, still treated as second class. But I can feel it in the air, revolutions in the forecast. We came for greatness, but they don't want us to know. So they hid our history to keep us under control. All it takes is to take a stand. The enemy's not invincible, but we must come together as one nation indivisible.
20 million black people don't even know their own language. Why? Because he took it away from them. 20 million black people who don't even know the history of their ancestors. Why? Because he took it away from them. And if you're trying to tell them how thoroughly and completely they've been robbed, he says you're teaching hate. That's something to think about. Today you are coming out of college. You're coming out of the leading university. You're trying to go in a good direction, but you don't know which direction to go in.
think to answer that question, Saul, you have to analyze the nature of Southern politics since the 1950s. What you had in the 1940s is basically, well, I think Southern politics began with VOT's book. And what he did was analyze the Democratic Party, because you didn't have a Republican Party. He basically came up with the idea with parties are very factionalized. He came up with three different types of state party. It was all within a democratic framework, and it was all personality, cult-oriented type things. Race was not really an issue. Race didn't become an issue in the South again until 1954. Race could become an issue if someone happened to be soft on the issue, but no one was. So everyone was operating within the framework of a segregated society, so race never became an issue. Obviously, from 1954 to 1966, that 12-year period, race was the issue. And you can analyze, Earl Black wrote a book called Southern Governors and Civil Rights. There hadn't been a comprehensive book written like Key wrote, but Southern Governors and Civil Rights analyzes that period pretty good. And basically what he came up with is the segregation candidate. The candidate who best handled the segregation issue between 54 and 66 basically was the winner. But importantly, the race question was the top, was the issue in all Southern races. This continued up to 70. Now, once you had the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, by 66, blacks were participating enough in the system where by 70 was the first year. Race was still the dominant issue, but the candidate, but moderates were consistently winning primaries by 70 because you had a large number of blacks. In 70 is a good year to use because that's you had Jimmy Carter, you had Dale Bumpers, you had Reuben Askew, you had Bill Brock, you had John West, you know, across the board. That was a new breed of Southern politicians. To some extent because they were image guys and media was being used, but more importantly, that was the first year statistically that blacks were participating enough to where a moderate would get through the primary.
That was also the year that Carter ran against Sanders using race.
66 Carter ran against Sanders.
66
race. Carter, by the way, is an interesting phenomenon. Most people don't know this, but you can get acetate. Carter ran a race against Sanders. No, wait a minute. Let me think of the Carter thing. Carter ran first against Lester Maddox.
Yeah, the Sanders thing was 70.
Yeah, the Sanders thing, you're right. That's when he did the baseball pictures and all that. But that was that was not overt racism and so forth. But he was doing that in a Democratic primary, positioned himself to come back in the general election as the moderate against Hal Seward, the conservative. But by the way, just as a point of reference, what Carter did was go out in 66 and run as the moderate candidate against Lester and lost, and then used the Lester Maddox formula, the same formula Maddox used.
That was also true of George Cornwallis.
Oh, sure.
When he first ran.
Well, his famous, I ain't gonna be out Nicholas thing.
Right. All right, go ahead.
But the point I'm making is race was the dominant issue in Southern politics, all through the 50s, the 60s. The 70s began two things really, competitive two parties. 60s you had the Goldwater phenomenon, you had Nixon and so forth. But basically the 70s is when you had a crystallized two-party thing beginning. So in 1980, I think the crucial thing of 1980 is number one, the two dominant issues in Southern politics, which had been race and party, meaning you have to be a Democrat to win, had pretty well dissolved. And the main issues became the economy and national defense. Now, that's interesting in that those are the issues, basically, that Goldwater. In other words, the South in 1964 was considered reactionary, Neanderthalic, and so forth. because we want mainstream on, not only on the race thing, but on the economic issues and national defense and all. We were considered, you know, ultra conservative and everything. What happens is a guy like Reagan, who campaigns in 1980 on a 1964 Goldwater platform, minus the boo-boos and obviously the Voting Rights Act, TVA and all that bullshit. But when you look at the economics and the national defense, what had happened is that the South went from being behind the times to being the mainstream. In other words, so what you had was two things happening that totally washed away the Southern strategy, the Harry Dent type Southern strategy, and that is, that whole strategy was based, although it was more sophisticated than a Bilbo or a George Wallace, it was nevertheless based on coded racism. The whole thing, busing, we want a Supreme Court judge that won't have busing, anything you look at could be traced back to the issue in the old Southern strategy. Now, it was not done in a blatantly discriminatory way, but the Reagans did not have to do a Southern strategy for two reasons. Number one, race was not a dominant issue. And number two, the mainstream issues in this campaign had been, quote, Southern issues since way back in the 60s. So Reagan goes out and campaigns on the economics and on national defense. The whole campaign was devoid of any kind of racism, any kind of reference. And I'll tell you another thing y'all need to think about that's even surprised me, is the lack of interest, really, a lack of knowledge right now in the South among white voters on this Voting Rights Act. I brought all these Republican state chairmen up here to just kind of soothe them down and say, look, before we had this meeting, look, we may not do exactly what y'all like. And what I found out about is all of them were very passive. They said, we'll pretty well go along with whatever you want. And I've looked at polls in the last 4 or 5 months, and there's just no interest or no intensity on that thing among white voters. Now, that in 1969, me bringing up, or Harry Dent, rather than me bringing up those Southerners, would have been a very big reported thing. The Southerners would have come up here with some kind of manifesto. They would have, that would have been a big, major news story, ongoing and all that
I'm
shit.
just wondering though, how much residual there is to, okay, so there's no race, but there is busing as an issue. Busing. The president has made it a bit of an issue.
Okay, let's talk about what an issue is, Saul. When I talk about an issue, I say I'm a pollster, okay? I ask an open-ended question. What's the biggest issue facing you today? You poll 600 people, and then you put on a continuum. 45 to 55% will say economics. 12% will say national defense. Busing will not even register on the top 10. On an aggregate, busing hadn't been on the top 10 of open-ended issue questions in any poll I've seen since 1972. And it's gone, and now it's gone. No, excuse me, Saul, I don't want to lie. It's gone, it's been on the top 10, but it hadn't been a top, and by 1978 to 1980, busing hadn't even been a top 10 issue. So sure, everything's an issue, but I'm saying this.
I'm just wondering how much residual there is that cold racism in the anti-government, anti-Washington, states' rights, return to states' rights, defederalize, how much there is in the old days, the residual of the old days there is in the antipathy towards welfare programs, poverty programs, which after all are blacks.
Fine.
And other political, social, economic programs which do give power to black folks or poor folks or identify with giving power. But again, it's not purely Southern, but the Legal Services Corporation. They give problems to the municipalities in Mississippi who want to gerrymander and those kind of. I'm just wondering.
Well, sure, okay, but I think this, and don't get me wrong, you go out to these white country clubs, and they're still gonna sit out there and say, well, shit, I'm tired of, I'm tired of them getting everything and all that. But the bottom line is, don't give those out yet. I gotta look at it. The bottom line is, it's a mainstream thing now, and it's not grounded in racism as much as it is kind of the network movie syndrome. I'm mad as hell and I ain't gonna take it. Now, statistically, the poor people and the people receiving all these things are blacks. Now, some of the Southern stuff may still be racism, but it's such a widespread thing now, and I think it's almost developing into a class struggle type issue rather than a racism issue.
When you say widespread, you mean national?
I mean, I can go to a country club. I won't go to a country club. Hello? Okay. Hey, buddy. Fine, what's up? But what I'm saying is you can sit in a cocktail anywhere and they'll start saying, well, I'm tired of these fuckers getting welfare.
Anywhere in the
and all that.
country,
Yeah.
that's what
And,
it's national.
and if it were white, it wouldn't make any difference. There's always going to be a certain, I'll say this, my generation, your and my generation, will be the first generation of Southerners that won't be prejudiced. Totally. I mean, hello? Well, y'all leave me alone. In other words, my parents, and even people 5 and 10 years older than me are touched with things that were beat into them in the period. But what I'm saying is that has really been sublimated by a bunch of other issues. But more importantly, is people in the South are just like any people in the history of the world. Once something becomes a reality, people adapt to it. We fought, we kicked, we struggled with all of these problems, first in 54, then the voting rights stuff in 64. But by 70s, it was a reality. And you just adapt to reality and move on. So I'm not saying that it was done down there because we thought it was great or we finally understood or anything. It became a part of our life. So in these 80 elections, and so when I'm saying back to our Southern strategy, so the Southern strategy now, basically, and here's another thing, it's all you and I talked about, is who controls elections in the South. Statewide elections in the South are controlled by, if you want to use the term, George Wallace voters. Because statistically, blacks went for John F. Kennedy in mass, they went for Johnson in mass, they went for Humphrey in mass, they went for Carter in mass, and they went for Carter in mass, and McGovern in mass, all 6. The country club whites went for the Republican every time in mass. So, the blue-collar voter in 1964 goes for Goldwater. He carries the deep South. Remember, the other two groups went the same way. 1968, the blue-collar voter goes for George Wallace. He carries the South, deep South. 1972, he goes for Nixon. 1976, he goes for Carter. Now, we're leading up to my whole strategy in the deep South in 1980, which I discussed with you. In other words, the whole focus group in the South is that blue-collar worker. Now, that's important when you tie it back into the racist thing, because he was also the guy who was most threatened by the black, and was also most prone to be, quote, a racist. And until 1980, and in a little bit in 1976, the race issue is how you approach that vote. Plus, the most conservative guy on fiscal matters always got his vote, and the toughest son of a bitch in national defense and foreign policy always got his vote. So what happened is Jimmy Carter in 76 was able, plus these people, regional pride is always biggest with the lower intellects and lower income groups. So on the basis of regional pride, I'm one of you, and fuzzing the issues and making it look like, being a born-again Christian, which smacks of conservatism, and trying to be conservative, he gets that group in mass in 76, carries the whole South. Well, once he got that, and this is an important point of what I'm going to say, it was his to lose. It wasn't ours to win, it was Carter's to lose. All Carter had to do was run in place. Well, he didn't do that. He took that for granted, he went out, didn't stay on the issue, and we were able to go back in, which I didn't think we were going to be. I thought we could really raid him and hamstring and bring him back in there. But what he did is default his own turf. not on anything to do with racism, or the race question, but on economics and on national defense. It was his to lose. So, the fact of the matter is, the South is Reagan's to lose now. And as long as, if Reagan goes and denounces his own economic policy, or doesn't balance the budget, or, he could lose the South. But if not, he's gonna get the South.
But he's not gonna lose the South if he goes along with what the blacks want on voting rights, is what you're saying.
That should be a thrust of this. In other words, in 1968, the whole Southern strategy that Hearing was put together, the Voting Rights Act would have been a central part of keeping the South. Now they don't have to do that. All you got to do to keep the South is for Reagan to run in place on the issues he's campaigned on since 1964. And that's fiscal conservative, balancing the budget, cutting taxes, the whole cluster, and being tough on national defense. And it's going to be very hard for Reagan to.
But whether I'm not saying that he does this consciously, but the fact is that he does get to the Wallace voter and to the racist side of the Wallace voter by doing away with legal services, by doing away with cutting down on food stamps.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not. Is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this.
All right, I won't hear it.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Reminds me of a great story that was told in one of the biographies of Huey Long. Huey went to a Catholic hospital, which had been a target of the racists down there because there were white folks working on blacks, white nurses working on black patients. It was also, he had promised lots of blacks more jobs and upgrading jobs when he was running for election. So he went to the hospital one day and just raised hell about all that white people working on blacks. And why did they get some more blacks in the place to work on blacks rather than have these clean and looking white nurses working on blacks? So he satisfied both constituents. Got blacks more jobs, did away with money.
Yeah, and Huey Long, interesting, he was the only single one of those guys who you can always find some traces of that stuff, but consistently didn't use the race relationship.
Well, he used it, but then he turned it around to himself.
Yeah, but I'm talking about when you look at who at Bartleman and all these guys.
What about this thing that you read?
I don't want to show that yet, because I'm not satisfied with it. That answers your question.
Okay, good enough.
Is that all you?
That's all I think.
You doing all right?
I'm doing fine. How about you? We never did get to the barbecue.
I don't want to do that.
I made some out of the house over there for that. Well, Southern style. I mean, Texas style.
Well, let me give you.
Well, that was a good introduction.
Yeah.
I want to take you back to 1970, and you could sort of jump from 70 to 80 and ask you what happened to the...
Wait a minute. Let me make sure Saul knew that I didn't want to quote it.
Oh.
Hey, Saul.
So I want to take you back to 1970. You jumped from 70 to 80 and the impact of the race issue on the South. And I'm particularly interested in the statewide races and how you see race was, what importance race was in the race for governor and senator.
In the 70s.
Yeah, in the 70s. Well, it just didn't, with the election of these moderate Democrats we talked about, it didn't just fade away. It stayed there, and I wondered how you saw it.
Well, I think what happened is what, all these different factors are independent factors, but they work together also. So you had two things happening in the 70s. You had a situation where, starting in 66 and on through the 80s, the moderate or most liberal, as long there's an invisible line of where you are, when you become a liberal in the South. When you become a liberal, you're in trouble, even in the Democratic primary. But if you're a good moderate, you stake out a victory in the Democratic primary, is what was happening in the Democratic primaries in the South. In other words, you came to a situation by 72, 74, and then right on through the 70s. Racism was a not only a non-issue, but it was a dangerous and self-destructive issue in a Democratic primary. But blatant liberalism, in most cases, was just as destructive. So what you had was kind of a moderation of the Democratic primary. Then you had the development that started in the 60s, but a hardening up and affirming development of a 25 to 35% Republican Party, Republican base vote. You had the advent of Republican primaries in the South. There might have been 2 or 3 primaries in the 60s, but in the 70s you had a new creature called Republican primaries. I know we had our first one in South Carolina in 1974. Basically, conservative primaries were extremely conservative, extremely right-wing. Now, race never became an issue as such. It was basically who was the most conservative. And when I say conservative, I mean conservative. Hello? But race was never discussed within the framework of a Republican primary. Then you had to go to a general election. What you had was a Republican conservative against a moderate Democrat. The Republican conservative got generally, that's where first of all, the issues were devoid of any talk about race and so forth for the most part. But what you had winning these, in the general election, the candidate that could best, the way the Republicans won was getting the Wallace vote, getting the blue collar vote, getting the white vote. So, any way that you, in a coded sense, any racism that was used.
Like Brock's race in the 70s when he won the Senate seat.
Yeah.
And even the one in Virginia.
That's right. Any racism was used.
Long was defeated.
Yeah. Well, busing, all of these coded.
Gurney in Florida.
Yeah.
Gurney in Florida.
Well, I didn't follow that race at all.
Mm-hmm. But just to tie in with this, you talked about the white blue-collar worker being sort of a pivotal vote. You were talking about presidential elections in particular. But now just what I'm more interested in is the gubernatorial and the U.S. Senator race.
Gubernatorial.
And in those, wouldn't you say that in most states, the Democratic candidate has been able, in that period from about 72 to 78, to pull those voters, to keep those voters, and that's why the Republican Party.
That is right. Now, let me give you an example of someone who I'm very close with and have been for years. Is Strom Thurmond. Basically, Republicans, and I think 80 could be a watershed year, but that's irrelevant. Republicans still don't get elected statewide in the South. And the reason is the Republican Party has not been able to put together a coalition of enough blue-collar people, George Wallace type voters, and Republican, country club people. That's
what you say about 80? Did you say 80 was?
80 was the first year that Republicans did that, on another level other than just presidential. In other words, Richard Nixon in 72 in the 5th Congressional District of South Carolina gets 72% of the vote. The Republican congressional candidate gets 31, and you had that across the whole South. In other words, you have to totally separate presidential politics from the rest of politics. But 80, you know, East wins, Hawkins wins. Across the South, the candidate that best dealt with the economic issues got 71% of George Wallace type vote. The whole key is getting 70% of that vote. It's very tough to do. Those people are my pappy was a Democrat, and his pappy was a Democrat type people. So in order to get them, you have to have some very sexy, appealing type of verbiage in the campaign and the right kind of issue to get to them. Strom Thurmond's been able to do that better than anyone. He is always, Strom Thurmond got 82% of the white voters in 1978. He literally got all of the Republicans and all of the blue-collar type voters. The average Republican candidate has not been able to penetrate the blue-collar voter out there.
Strom is an exception, of course, because he.
Yeah, that's right, and he has been a
all
Democrat, and
Democrat.
he campaigns in a very, well, I'll put it to you this way, I've managed 27 Republican campaigns in the South, and I have never used the word Republican, or never put a Republican symbol on any campaign letter or any campaign thing. You don't win elections in the South, and I think this is still the case, by advertising that you're a Republican. What you have to do is put your candidate up there and have the best candidate, and have the best issues, put together a coalition of basically 30% Republican and you know, basically the breakdown now is you've got a base of 30% Republican, 40% Democrat, 45% Democrat, and the rest independents. So you literally have to get out there and put all the independents together and all the Republicans together. And there has not really been a meaningful Republican Party in the South in the 70s to the extent of other than Virginia, which the way I analyze the parties, I did a paper in like 78 analyzing the parties. You know, Virginia is a statistical artifact, and it's not a southern state as such demographically. When you look at the deep South, you know, the deep South is one thing, and then the peripheral South is another. Well, it's,
Yeah, well, how do you see the race in the at this level, the sub-presidential level? Of course, you know, I can see your argument about Reagan's use of the issue or non-use of it, but he has a national constituency. But how is the Republican Party going to come to grips with it?
well, I believe.
I mean, I think Carol Campbell's an interesting
I assume you know he's been a
example.
client of mine for 10 years.
Oh, is that right? I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and
Well, they got Campbell and I back to back in this.
Oh, oh, yeah. I'll have to take a look at this. He's a very interesting politician, and in this interview,
Well,
he was very candid about the black vote. He talked about that race in South Carolina in '78 for the governorship, and the use of the appeal of the Republican candidate to, I guess, the black voters, and how it backfired on him because it was a delicate thing. He said he went out and ran radio ads saying, "Black people, why vote for the Democrats? What have they given you? The one-party system, segregation, and so forth." But he said, well, he overdid it, and I thought that was interesting.
Campbell was a guy who I managed every campaign he had.
Uh-huh.
So we're kind of two guys that grew up together and stuff. Well, I think, in my judgment, Karl Marx is the type of thing. Race and religion will always be, but they'll always be the real issues ultimately are the economic issues. I'm not sophisticated enough to be an economic determinist or anything like that. But race will be within the framework because I feel like that there's almost going to be a class struggle type of atmosphere, and blacks are going to statistically be on one side of it. And I think, for instance, the Republican Party, and I tell these Republican candidates, are going to have a hard time getting black voters, masses of black voters, just by appointing a black to be the Air Force Secretary or something like that. They're either going to have to change their entire issues to appeal to the masses, or keep the same issues, forget racism, let the chips fall where they may, and you're still going to have a black-white split, I think, just because of the economics involved. Well, let me tell you something I did. I did a study for graduate work of the Thurman campaign, which I directed in 1978. We got about 8% of the black vote in the traditional black precincts. Then I went back and selected 300 blacks out of, I've got a tape of every registered voter in the state. So I went and selected 300 blacks out of areas that were 98 to 96% white, that were $30,000 a year above people, meaning black lawyers, black doctors, black people who were making $30,000, which in 78 in South Carolina is about like making $60,000. Thurman got 38% of that black vote. So now, what affirmative action and all this is going to do in the long run is create a legitimate black middle class, an upper middle class. That voter, in my judgment, will be more likely to vote with his economic interests than he will anything else. And that is the voter that I think just through a fairly slow but very steady process will go Republican. Because I'm finding that now. The blacks that have helped me in the campaigns have been doctors, lawyers, and people like that, and they're very interested in getting involved. And they're getting nothing out of the Democratic Party. They're getting nothing. So I think that is basically what's going to happen, and I think race as such is going to dissolve as an issue, but you are going to have the race question in the sense of, on one side, you're going to have a guy who's a millionaire, and he's got something in common with a guy who's making $10,000 a year. He's busting his ass, and he's putting into the system, and he's paying taxes, and somebody else is not doing anything and taking out of the system. Those two guys, the George Wallace voter and the millionaire have something in common. And I'll tell you something else. Statistically, as the number of non-producers in the system move toward 50%, that makes the system more and more polarity to where that drives the Wallace guy and the traditional Republican closer and closer together as they become threatened as their taxes go up and as inflation goes up because of the non-productive side of society.
Well, just moving away from the race issue, just in general, you don't have, from what you said, I don't get the feeling that you have tremendous optimism for the Republican Party in the near future below the presidential level in the South. Is that right, from what you were saying?
No, let me tell you. I think that we have tremendous opportunity on the Senate level, gubernatorial, and number one, statewide. In other words, I believe in kind of a funnel down, presidential, where the Senate, the governor, then congressional, then the state houses. I think that you have a situation now because of this fractured party identification. Like I say, that's fractured, that the candidate that best approaches and best identifies with the economic issues and national defense will win. Every campaign I was involved in, I'll just name a few. I had Gene Johnson against Richard Pryor. I had Tommy Hartnett against Bug Ravenel. I had John Napier against John Generette. I had Floyd Spence against Tom Turnipseed. And all those campaigns were populist.
This is a consulting organization that
I was president of, as well as doing Southern, Deep South and Kuwait. And in all of those campaigns, plus I was peripherally involved because one of my partners with the Paula Hawkins thing and the East thing. And in every one of those races, the reason we won is that we best identified with economic issues, and best identified with national defense. Put ourselves over there, put the Democrat over here. Now, in a situation where the Democrat best identified with the most credibility with the economic issues and all, he won with no trouble. South Carolina, Fritz Hollings walked over his other guy. He was able to position himself as being conservative on the budget committee, this, that, and the other, and being in command. He had no problem. We were able to print Richardson Pryor as a big spender, part of the problem type guy, inflationary type guy. Same with Bug Ravenel. Placed our guy as the conservative and this, that, and the other. I think we're now down to to real issues. I mean, economics and national defense. And I think in any given situation, that the Republican can best stake out those issues, he wins, statewide or on a congressional basis. And that never has been the case. 80 is, I think, the watermark year in that in the South.
You mentioned a fractured party identification situation. These white blue-collar Southerners, they, when asked by surveyors what party you belong to, they invariably say Democratic Party. Are you saying that?
Or independent.
Or you'd say, yeah, or independent. Rarely Republican. But if they consistently vote Republican or can be lured to vote Republican, at some point you almost want to call them Republican.
Well, sure, they may want to, but they will call themselves independents an awful long time. Because they're still voting for the Democrat that lives down the street that's on the county council. Or the Democrat, they are independents because, they're voting for a Republican for president, Republican for U.S. Senate, Republican congressman, but there's 15 other offices on the ballot, and every one of those guys they're voting for is a Democrat.
When is that going to change?
Well, that's a good, now, the local level is a different, okay, first of all, I did a paper on Congress, and I'm sure you've seen the same numbers. A U.S. Senator has a 61% chance of getting reelected. A congressman has a 96.4% chance of getting reelected. Simply because of the homogeneity of the district, the whole bit. So, therefore, those simple statistics, I can look back at 1980 and say, I didn't think it, but sure it was possible for us to pick up all those Senate seats. Statistically it was 40% chance. That's pretty good numbers. It's not great. But it's very tough to fight the statistics that have nothing to do with party identification, nothing to do with anything else. Basically the power of incumbency in a congressional district. Now, when you get down even on a smaller level, these little state houses and state senates, and you got all these incumbents. My House of Representatives, South Carolina, we've done some revolutionary things. We now control the congressional delegation. 4 Republican congressmen, a Republican U.S. senator, 20 Republicans in the House, 125 Democrats. Those 125 Democrats are going to run for re-election. There's no way to entice them to switch parties because you can't go out and tell a guy, if you switch, we'll give you all this good stuff, because they're still in the majority party. And as long as those guys are running for re-election, so the only way you basically win is in new seats. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So you slowly creep up on new seats.
Well,
there's actually 3 parties in the South. There's a statewide party system, there's a congressional district party system, and there's a local party system. And they're 3 separate entities. There's some similarities, some changes and anything else, but there's actually 3 party systems, which generates a whole set of circumstances in each state.
Are the Southerners looking to the Reagan administration for assistance in boosting realignment at the local level?
Yeah,
and can they?
But very candidly, this is going to be very tough. I think that the whole nature of politics, because of the fractured party system, because of the media system, and so forth, creates a situation in which one individual or one institution, presidency, an individual being President Reagan, is going to have a hard time affecting behavior in situations unrelated to his own specific thing. In other words, Reagan has a good chance of affecting behavior when he gets on TV to talk about, please support my tax program, please support Graham Louder. But for any politician in America, has a tough time anymore of affecting behavior in other races. Now, I have not done a paper, but I've read studies, and I firmly, as a practitioner, can tell you that from the 70s, starting in the 70s, there's a very, very definite trend line on endorsements having decreasing effect. And now, South Carolina, again, as an example, I supported Reagan. I was his campaign director. Jim Edwards and Strom Thurmond, everybody came out for continent. Now, in 1955 or something like that, there's no question. There wouldn't even been a race in South Carolina. But as much as Thurman's got more credibility than any other political figure probably in the country within his own state, he was not able to keep us from just walking all over John Thomas. If it had been Strom Thurmond versus Ronald Reagan, Thurmond would have killed him. But what I'm saying in general, the president can't go at him, even like he could in the 60s, but he couldn't do it in the 60s. See, in other words, it never happened. What they wanted to happen in the 60s never happened. So I can't, in other words, we can do a lot of things to help. We can go out and bring candidates in here and help recruit them. Hopefully the block grant, a whole bunch of things to help. But I do not see one person or one institution drastically being able to re-alter something like this. I think it's going to,
But if any one person is doing it, you've got the job.
That's right. What I'm doing is saying, he's got the job, but I'm trying to be reasonable about my work. Let me see this thing. This may be something you can use. Type thing I'm writing, but it basically addresses this same thing, the precinct organization.
Well, what about that race in Mississippi yesterday?
Well, it's a good example of what I'm talking about. If we had to, there ain't no question that Reagan is popular as shit down there, because I saw 3 polls on the thing. He's up in the 70s. And if endorsements were all they were cracked up to be, the guy would have walked all over this board. That's just one of many, many issues, and the more important issues are right down in there.
The heavy black vote, of course, wanted for him. So
sure.
The Republican had a majority of white support.
Oh, sure. I need to.
Celebrate the foundational Black American culture of freedom fighting and resistance with the first annual Areta 5K run. This cultural experience will honor our FBA ancestors and icons while harnessing energy from our past to power our future. There will be security at this event to ensure everyone has a safe and enjoyable experience. Areta Run is a cultural event for family and friends. Strollers and wheelchairs are welcome. The in-person event will include a free 1-mile fun walk and will be held on December 17th in Tampa, Florida. Unable to make the live event, you can also participate virtually anywhere from December 17th to December 30th. All registered participants will receive the official Areta Run finisher medal, t-shirt, and more with the ability to upload their race time to the official site. Live event participants will receive the time race scores, professional finisher photo, video, and your name will be announced as you're welcomed across the finish line. Enjoy the post-race after party and refuel with a traditional FBA breakfast. You can also help us settle fun family debates like sugar or salt and grits. Prepare with family workouts and runs and post on social media using the hashtag Areta Run. For register info and sponsorship opportunities, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Click the link in the bio. Hope to see you.